June 17, 2024, 8-year-old Amanda Robin was declared missing in Pittsburgh. It all started on an ordinary afternoon after the family had settled down for lunch. But within a single hour, everything tragically changed. One moment, little Amanda was playing in her room. The next, she was gone. The apartment descended into chaos. A mother's scream was heard as she ran from room to room, her voice hoarse from screaming her daughter's name. Drawers were pulled open, closets checked and rechecked, beds overturned in a desperate search for any sign of her child. Her husband was just as frantic. Tears streamed down his face as he searched every possible hiding spot. The couch was pushed aside, curtains flung back, even the bathroom cabinets were opened as if, by some miracle, Amanda could be found inside. What had started out an ordinary day, ended in misery and tears. Amanda was nowhere to be found. But what police would discover 2 weeks later would leave everyone stunned. A grieving father. A broken husband. It was all a facade. An innocent face worn by a murderer and a monster. So how could a father commit such a horrendous crime? How could a man who loved his family destroy the life of his young daughter and lead to his suicide of his beloved wife? This is the story of a family who lost everything. The story of little Amanda Robin, who was brutally molested, drugged and killed by her own father. So before this dark event occurred, who was Amanda? And what was her life like? Amanda was an only child to Denise Robin and George Robin. A couple that had been married for 20 years. But Amanda wasn't just any child. She was a miracle. For 12 years, her parents had waited for her. 12 long years of hope and heartbreak, years of shattered dreams and whispered prayers. Her birth had been both a blessing and a test of faith. She came into the world fragile, her tiny body fighting against nature itself to survive. Doctors had warned them from the beginning. Amanda just might not make it, her heart was weak, unable to sustain her for long. Every day was uncertain. Every breath she took was a gift. The years that followed were filled with hospital visits, sleepless nights, and endless fear. Every fever, every cough, every sign of weakness sent her parents into panic. But against all odds, she held on. Amanda was a true survivor and she somehow fought death and defeated it. When she turned 5, a breakthrough changed everything. The police worked tirelessly. They knocked on every door, questioned every resident, and asked the same haunting question over and over, "Did you see anything?" But no one had. Security footage became their last hope. If someone had taken Amanda, surely the cameras would reveal something, anything. But there was nothing. The footage showed the apartment complex exactly as it had always been. No strangers. No forced entry. No suspicious movement. No sign of Amanda leaving. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Neighbors were baffled. Some joined the search, scouring the streets and parks, calling out her name. Flyers were printed with her bright, smiling face. Had she wandered outside? Had someone lured her away? But none of it made sense. She had been inside. It was the middle of the day, just before lunch. Amanda had been in the living room quietly playing with her favorite doll. Or so Denise thought. But when lunch was served and they called for her, there was no answer. Denise thought maybe she had gone to her room. But when she pushed open the bedroom door, everywhere was still. The blankets undisturbed. The toys exactly where they had been that morning. Then, a new fear took hold. Denise's mind went to the worst possible place. Her health. Had Amanda's heart condition returned? Had she collapsed somewhere, unable to call for help? Had she been hurt? The thought was too much for George and Denise to bear. Days passed. Then a week. Denise couldn't eat. George could barely function. Both struck with grief. The apartment that had once been filled with Amanda's laughter now felt like a tomb. Hope began to fade. And for once, Denise and George could agree that it wasn't time to break what was left of their marriage. Denise had asked for a divorce 2 months ago. She had decided she wanted a better life. A better life for her child. George was not the man she met, he wasn't the man she fell in love with. So what had changed? 22 years ago, life had been different. Back then, the world had seemed full of possibilities. They had met in college, 2 young souls trying to carve out their futures. She had just arrived in Pittsburgh, fresh-faced and eager, but weighed down by financial burdens. The tuition fees, the cost of rent, the endless bills, the debts. She was on the verge of giving up when he stepped in. He had always been kind. Thoughtful. The type of man who would give his last dollar to someone who needed it more. He helped her clear her debts, quietly covering what she could not. He never made a show of it, never asked for anything in return. At first, she resisted. She was proud. She didn't want to owe anyone anything. But he had a way of making her feel safe, of making her believe that she wasn't alone in her struggles. Their relationship started slowly. Late-night study sessions turned into long walks through the city. Coffee dates turned into something deeper. By the time they graduated, they were inseparable. He was ambitious, driven, already securing a promising job before even leaving college. She, on the other hand, dreamed of being a writer, but life had other plans. Marriage came next. It was just a quiet ceremony surrounded by close family and friends. They were young, in love, and for a while, it felt like nothing could touch them. He was doing well. More than well. He provided for both of them, making sure she never had to worry. They traveled, explored, built a life together. He bought them a house, a beautiful, modest home that was supposed to be there forever. But then, everything changed. He lost most of his savings in a bad investment. It was a mistake, an unfortunate turn of luck, but it hit them hard. Then, the final blow came shortly after. George lost his job. The company was downsizing. There were no second chances, no time to adjust. One day, he was the provider and the next, he was unemployed. Denise had been a housewife for years. She had never needed to work. Now, they were barely scraping by. They tried to stay strong. They told themselves it was temporary, that things would get better. But the bills piled up. They were drowning. And in the midst of it all, their marriage suffered. At night, George worked at a local hardware store, stocking shelves, helping customers, doing anything to make ends meet. But nothing seemed to work. His efforts, despite being tireless, felt like they were never enough. Each day, he came home exhausted, his body aching, and his mind overwhelmed by the weight of his failures. Yet when he stepped through the door, he was met with silence. His wife, once his partner in everything, barely acknowledged his presence. There was no dinner waiting, no warm greeting, no love. He would go to bed, alone with his thoughts, and the cycle would repeat. He would wake up to an empty kitchen. Their relationship, once vibrant and filled with hope, had turned cold. There was no intimacy, no closeness, nothing to remind them of the connection they had once shared. Her excuses came often, but they felt hollow. She would tell him she was too tired, too overwhelmed, yet she had plenty of energy for everything else, except for him. The years passed in bitterness, but through it all, there was one thing they could still hold on to. Their daughter, Amanda. She was the one thing that still kept them going, the one thing they could both agree on, the one thing they loved with everything they had. But even Amanda couldn't heal the rift between them. Every time the husband tried to reach out, his wife would pull away. There was no affection, no kindness. No smiles. It was like they were strangers. Things only grew worse. And then, it happened. Denise made a decision that changed everything. After 4 years of this painful, broken existence, she had had enough. She couldn't take it anymore. She didn't want to be trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who could barely keep his head above water. And so, she made the decision to leave. But she didn't leave right away. No, she waited. She bided her time, waiting for the perfect moment, when she could leave him without making it seem too obvious. Denise started seeing someone else, a man from her past, a high school friend who had reappeared after all these years. At first, George didn't notice. After all, he was too consumed with his own struggles to pay attention to the subtle shifts in her behavior. But then, it became impossible to ignore. The gifts. The money. The constant messages. The visits. She would meet him at a coffee shop or go out for lunch. Sometimes, he would come to the house, pretending to be just a friend. But as the weeks went by, George began to notice the changes in her demeanor. The way she smiled when she looked at her phone, the way she would always rush off to the bathroom after receiving a call. And then, the gifts, expensive ones, gifts that she couldn't have bought with the money they were living on. At first, she denied it. She told him he was imagining things. She said this man was just a friend, that he was only checking in because they had known each other for so long. But as time went on, George couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He felt uncomfortable, uneasy in his own home. And so, he confronted her. He warned her, told her to stop inviting him over, to stop accepting his gifts. It was then that the tension exploded. Denise became angry, defensive. She finally admitted the truth. The man wasn't just a friend. He was her lover. Fred Taylor was her lover. And with that admission was the final blow that destroyed what was left of George's humanity. Denise wanted a divorce. She wanted to be with her lover. The man who could give her the life she dreamed of. The man who could offer her the future she believed she deserved. George stood there, shocked. He couldn't believe it. His entire world crumbled in that moment. He had always been a good man. He had always tried. He had loved her. He had given everything for their family, for their daughter. But none of it mattered now. His heart shattered, his mind numb with disbelief. His wife was leaving him, not just for another man, but for the idea of a life that he could never give her. Denise was already making plans to leave, to start fresh with someone else, and George was left alone, his dreams and hopes crushed. 1 week later, when she served him the divorce papyrus, George collapsed in front of her. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. He couldn't lose his family. But no matter how much he cried, no matter how much he pleaded, she remained unmoved. Denise and George had both made peace with their divorce. George even offered to give her full custody of Amanda. She needed someone to care for her. He didn't want to put her through the struggles of joint custody. But now Amanda was missing. It was 2 weeks. Nothing had been found. All efforts were futile. It was looking hopeless. The grief of losing their daughter was a hollow pit in both their hearts, but George's resolve never wavered. Even in the midst of their unbearable sorrow, he still insisted on pushing forward with the divorce. Denise, devastated, couldn't go ahead with the divorce. She wanted to find her child. She wanted to find her lovely daughter. It seemed like neither of them could speak about it, at least not to each other. Denise too broken to even think about moving on with the divorce proceedings, too consumed by the grief. She simply couldn't bring herself to sign the papers. And with this, George knew he'd won. He had played the twisted dark game of control. But taking the one thing that Denise valued the most. Fred Taylor was now out of the picture. Denise was broken. But one afternoon, everything changed. All it took was a visit from Denise's sister, Phoebe. She had arrived in an attempt to console Denise, though there was little anyone could do to heal the pain. She saw her sister's lifeless stare and noticed how little movement there had been in the house since the disappearance. Denise hadn't been able to get out of bed for days. The grief had paralyzed her. The sister knew how deep the rift had grown between them, how torn they both were. She was worried for her sister's mental state and begged them to rethink. But George still stood firm in his refusal to back down from the divorce. Every word he said to his wife only seemed to deepen the divide between them. The more they argued, the more she seemed to distance herself from him, as if retreating into a shell of disbelief and sorrow. After a heated argument that evening, Denise left in tears, saying she needed to take a walk. Phoebe begged. She pleaded with George to change his mind about the divorce, but he only got aggressive. Saying that Denise knew something about Amanda's disappearance. He promised to press charges. He promised to inform the authorities. He accused her of using their daughter as a weapon. Phoebe assured him that Denise would never do something so vile. Finally able to bring some semblance of peace, Phoebe offered to cook them dinner. The house was empty and she noticed they had little to nothing. Worried about her sister's well-being, she offered to attend least leave dinner behind. George agreed, but there was just one thing missing for the chicken curry sauce she wanted to make. Cornstarch. No matter how much they looked, they couldn't seem to have any left in the house. Finally, George offered to go to the store to get it. That's all it took to uncover Amanda's whereabouts. An offer for dinner. It makes us wonder how the little things can cause the bigger things to unfold. An offer to whip up dinner led to Phoebe being alone, and as she waited in the kitchen, seasoning the chicken and trying to get the potatoes together, she realized that there was a thudding in the ceiling. It was continuous and quite loud that she couldn't ignore. Curious, she went straight to the stairs and the noise only got louder. For a second, she couldn't help but think of an animal that had broken into the house. This made Phoebe curious and she made her way to the attic. When she forced the door open, the sight before her would haunt her forever. It was the most horrendous sight she'd ever seen. Her niece was naked, tied up and folded into a chair so small that her spine seemed disfigured. She was shaking, and as Phoebe got close, she noticed that Amanda wasn't just shaking, she was convulsing. It was horrific. And Phoebe immediately called 911. Little Amanda was rushed to the hospital and put under intensive care. For hours, she fought for her life. When Denise got the call, she fainted and didn't get to see her daughter until it was too late. Hours after the doctor did all they could, Amanda's heart failed. Her body had been battered and brutalized in ways that a young child should never endure. The doctors found wounds in places she had no business being injured. Internal wounds, bruises of forced penetration and residues inside her body that was fresh from that morning. Even that day, with his wife and Phoebe in the house, George had raped his 8-year-old daughter before he left to get cornstarch. Amanda told her aunt how her daddy had beaten her up, raped her over and over again and kept her naked in the attic for 2 weeks while she begged him to let her go. She was weak, but she was old enough to know what the monster did. George had told her of how he'd kill her and cut out her weak heart if she didn't keep quiet. For nights, she cried, hoping her mother would somehow know and come save her, but for 2 weeks nothing happened, until Phoebe arrived. Hours after the news, George was tracked and arrested at the bus station where he was about to flee town. Having returned home and met Phoebe's absence and Amanda no longer locked up, he'd figured the game was over. He'd been caught and nothing could save him. But the police were faster than he could think, and as soon as Phoebe had found Amanda, she knew it was George. He kept playing this very loud music right in the kitchen. I asked him why and he said he wanted it to calm him. It didn't make sense. She narrated. And George had always been an angry man, we all loved him like family, but what he did to Amanda, I know he's a monster. As soon as George was arrested, he didn't deny the crime. However, he blamed Denise for what she'd made him do. He told the authorities that Denise wanted to take his child away from him and he wouldn't allow that. In his words, he'd paid so much to fix her heart and now she was his own. His property. And he wasn't going to give her up for Denise and her new lover. The court proceeding was set in motion. George didn't deny any of the charges. Rape, first-degree murder, he denied none. Unfortunately, Amanda didn't live to witness her father face justice. On the first day of the trial, Amanda died in the hospital when her heart failed. She died a survivor. Struggling to stay alive. To see the next sunrise. But George had stolen that from her. Days after her death, Denise committed suicide in her family home during a visit. She hung herself from the ceiling and left a note for Phoebe to take care of her daughter. The family was enraged. They didn't drop the charges. Denise was gone. Amanda was gone and Phoebe was hell-bent on getting justice. On July 2024, George was sentenced to life imprisonment on all counts of murder and rape. Many would say that Amanda got her justice. But at what cost? Many would ask. What had destroyed their family? A lover? A threat of divorce? Or the darkness that lies within a betrayed man? Amanda was just a little girl. She didn't deserve to be brutalized for the perceived sins of her mother. Denise had the right to choose whom she wanted to be with. But hadn't she seen the signs of a controlling and bitter man? Had she really been so blind to George's anger and rage? Had she never seen the dark soul of her own husband? Anger. Revenge. Bitterness. This led to the loss of an innocent life, a child, a loving mother, and the destruction of a perfect family. This chilling tale will leave us with a question. How much can love endure? And how dark is the human soul?